Welcome back to the Fantasy Rugby Draft podcast. Thanks for downloading and listening. My name is Bruce Wilkinson. Joining me in the booth is the man primarily made of moss, Nathan Mossman. How are you, sir?
Oh, you managed to pronounce every single word in that sentence. I'm impressed. Well done.
Yeah, I've been working on that all week, enunciating.
Maybe you should just cut it now. That's as good. That's the high watermark.
Thanks for downloading. Yep.
See ya.
It's 9 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. No team news yet. What we're going to go through, and we're going to try and do it very quickly because we probably have an hour to get this out. We mentioned strength of schedule, and Mossman's got a few notes that he wants to run through and a few stats that he wants to run through. I want to just, to start with, talk about some news and notes. We've got rest weeks and under 20s to discuss, which seems to be the hot topic for a lot of fantasy managers at the moment. And if we get to it, then maybe we look at the foreign form and also looking at bye weeks down the line in the playoffs, but I might be able to cover that off while Mossman has to go get his spray tan. A little bit of admin. You can follow us on Twitter at Fantasy Rug Draft. That's Fantasy REG Draft, or drop us a note at support@fantasyrugbydraft.com. Please leave us a review. Some good ones coming through. Also share it with some mates of yours that you're playing draft with, just to spread the word a little bit. Every little bit counts for us. Strength of schedule stuff. Next, news and notes. So let's start with the Chiefs. What did you want to talk about with the Chiefs in particular? Because I think a lot of managers are looking at what the implications are for the rest weeks coming up. Do you want me to go through what I think's happening?
I'm sorry, you just coined a new term then, the managers. Which is clearly managers that just constantly complain.
It's fairly apt, isn't
I like it. We could use that. Yeah, absolutely. It'll just be like there'll be somebody in your league who's probably a manager. It's good. I like it. Well done.
I like it. So for managers, I think the big question marks are around DMAC, Anton Leonard-Brown and Brodie in the next few weeks with their All Black rest weeks. So I think we've got a little bit more clarity now that it's definitely going to be missing the Sharks game. After that, they have the Waratahs and the Crusaders, so I would expect, and this is finger in the air type stuff, that you might be without DMAC for the Sharks and the Tars game, and then back for the Crusaders game, which is a little bit more of a crunch match. They did release the squad this morning, or overnight at least, in South Africa, and Stevenson and Wainui are in the squad, which is cool. Certainly recovering from injury. I guess the question is how much game time they get against the Stormers this week. I would expect, certainly with Stevenson's case, I would have thought he might actually come off the bench. Wainui potentially could start, but I think they're probably more inclined to look at his comeback for the Sharks match. I was going to pose something to you actually around DMAC. So in the unusual situation where you have DMAC in your team and you haven't made the playoffs yet, would you consider trading DMAC away? And considering that, as I mentioned, leading up to the internationals, they've got the Sharks, the Tars, which he's going to miss, or the Crusaders, one of those. So he's going to miss two out of those three. And then afterwards in the playoffs, he's got the Highlanders, Brumbies and Canes. I'm not saying you sell them for nothing, but would you consider trading?
Yeah, it depends how far away from playoffs you are. How many games back you are, how desperate you are. There's probably, because there's no great solution, I think, to that problem anyway. There's no one problem player you could swap them for who's going to sort of solve all your problems, I think. Yeah,
I think you'd package it up. I think if I'd made the playoffs and I was trying to get DMAC, I think I'd be offering something like, Pollard and Eli Mino as a duel, like two really big players. Would you consider it in that instance, or is that overpaying, do you think?
No, it's probably not overpaying. I mean, you could definitely swing it to your advantage. They're not necessarily the two players I would go for, but I get your point.
Yeah. I was trying to list fly halves that have decent few games in front of them before to get you over that line. Elamano doesn't have any resting. Other players I'd probably throw in there are probably Bridge, Lamb and Folau. You wouldn't do just a 1-for-1. I think you'd need a fly half back.
You definitely need a fly half back because chances are your backup's nowhere near as good.
Yep, that's right. All right, let's get to the strength of schedule and some stats that you've had a look at, Mossman. We're 1 week wiser, I guess, but one more week of sample data to look at. What have you got for us?
So you're right, there's one more week of data. The other thing that I did, and I talked about it just quickly last week, because I realised that I'd gone for the points per game, which doesn't actually fit with what we're trying to do. And the reasons for that are, if somebody is generally a bench player and they come off the bench and score half a point or something, and then they get a start and they score 10 points, then all of a sudden it looks like that team's a really good matchup for players in that position, which is obviously not true. It's just about the start, so you sort of need to go for minutes there. So yeah, it's one of those situations where points per minute doesn't really tell the full story. And also likewise just for bench players generally. If certain teams and there's certain players in certain positions who always play 80, and then other teams will play, a guy for 60 and a guy 20, and obviously the guy that comes on for the 20 scores 2 points, and it looks like as an average points per game thing that team starts to look like a better matchup.
Yep.
Have you got me?
I've got you.
Cool. Okay. Excellent. Maths is better than English. Excellent. That's good. So that alters things a little bit, looking kind of overall at, which teams are the best matchups for different positions, from some of the ones that we touched on last week. But probably more important than all of that right now is, okay, what do those matchups mean versus the teams that those players have got coming forward? So I looked at it in two different ways, and one was the playoffs and the final, the semis and the final. And then, kind of weighting it towards the final a little bit, because there's no point obviously getting through the semis and just leaving yourself with nothing at the end. And then if you're in a different position and you've got to get to the playoffs, you haven't sort of got it locked up yet, what's the best players to look at coming up to that? So if we look at that perhaps first of all, and one of the things is that the Reds feature pretty prominently all the way through. They've definitely got the best run of fixtures probably leading up to the playoffs and also in the playoffs. So around outside backs, the Reds, Crusaders, Sunwolves and Waratahs are the four teams with the best matchups there. And so I think it brings players like Dalgunu into the equation. Yeah. And the Reds also very strong in the playoffs, so it's true there. The Waratahs also have strong playoff fixtures. The Crusaders don't. But like I said, if you're looking to get to the playoffs,
Yep.
I guess the thing is with those Crusaders players is they're probably, well, there's somebody that you could use that as a little bit of, a trade bait kind of thing if you were to say to somebody who does have Matalehi or Bridge or Habili, perhaps you could say to them, right, well, these guys are not going to be that helpful to you in the playoffs, so hey, how about you give them to me, that kind of thing.
Yep.
I do think, because the way that, obviously Aiden Toa is not somebody that you're rushing out to grab, but Dalgunu I think is probably a good trade target. He's just probably low enough on the radar that you could get him for something.
Yep.
And on the flip side to that, players with bad matchups in the playoffs, the Blues are one, and I'm sort of starting to think pretty seriously about what I can get for Rico.
100%. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and Falau would be a good target, and I don't know if people would do that, and it might be something that maybe we should have talked about this 2 or 3 weeks ago when he was still not playing, and that might have been the ideal time. But hey, that is what it is.
Yep, I think you might have an opportunity this week though, because the Waratahs play the Crusaders, and you could wave that out and say they're in Christchurch. They're going to get humped is the general perception, so I think you may be able to say, here you go, here's Rieko Ioane at home against the Hurricanes, there's going to be points in this match. You could paint a picture that does put it in the light, because I have the Waratahs as a talking point that I'll get into a little bit later as well, as a good run in, and that was exactly who I had on my list to say Falau, and someone that's A in form and has a good fixture list. But yeah, you'd have to do it earlier, when they're playing, and this is probably the last one before they start getting a bit easier. They do it now when you've got the Crusaders there and the big kind of, that's a bad matchup.
Yeah, that's right. And Rico scored points on the weekend and looked pretty good, so it wouldn't be too much of a hard sell in some ways. As far as midfielders are concerned, so Bulls and Reds, and that's true of fixtures leading up to the playoffs and in the playoffs. So good players to have right now would be Karevi and Creel.
Yep.
I don't really think there's anybody outside of those two that you want to be looking at. As far as fly halves go, this one's a little bit trickier because the Jags, for instance, have a good run up to the playoffs, but have really tough fixtures for fly halves as far as matchups for fly halves are concerned in the playoffs. So Sanchez is someone that you kind of want now, but you don't want in the playoffs. So that's is a little bit of a tricky one.
Yep. My concern with Sanchez as well, sorry to jump in, is at the start of the preseason, we talked with Paul Tate, and he mentioned there's going to be quite a bit of rotation going on in that Jaguares team with players like Matera and Sanchez, etc. And we haven't seen any resting with Sanchez, so I think it's just something to be cognizant of if you're pushing chips in to get Sanchez, is that you need to figure out who's going to be his backup and then grab him as well, because I'm just, he plays international break as well, so there maybe there's a few more minutes on the clock for him during that June break. Don't know.
Yeah, and Dashi, just in going back just for a second, so I mean, Tukelet is obviously, he's gone for the season now, which is good for some of the other players. I think Delgi and Moyano will be locked in, but they have tough playoff fixtures for outside backs. So Moyano might be somebody that I'd be thinking about shifting if I could. And I think, you probably get something half decent for him anyway.
Yep. Extension of that, I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to talk about it a little bit later, is Boffelli at 15. I think that's the natural assumption as well. We've only seen one sample size of Boffelli at 15, and it was not good. It was in fact, it was bad. And I do wonder whether the Jaguares are playing, or just a little bit of the eye test, they're playing a similar brand of football to the Highlanders, which is a lot of fullback kicking for territory and doing a defence and just putting a full court on them that way. And then they're asking Tuchelet to not necessarily run it back, but to be actually putting them in field position. And I just wondered if that might be now Boffelli's job. And extension to that is that I think you probably get a lot for him now. You've just mentioned the hard matchups in the playoffs. They also don't play in Gameweek 16. Which is the last regular season last regular season match for Fantasy Rugby Draft. So I think there's an opportunity to actually, is that right? They're playing 16 and they've got a bye week this week as well. So they're with all the South Africans in Game Week 16. So yeah, I think there's a good opportunity there, as you said, with Tuchelet's injury to sell Boffelli and looking at that schedule going ahead.
Yeah, so it might be a tough sell this week just because he's on a bye, and it's harder to obviously sell to someone who's trying to win, a player that's on a bye. But definitely next week, I think 100%. Boffelli is a guy that people will look at the points and say, he's been awesome, and that's completely fair. But there's some things coming up which make him not such a good option. Just in terms of fly halves, so the Highlanders have a good run of fixtures for fly halves coming up, so there should be some good games for Sapawanga leading up to the playoffs. Things are a little bit tougher through the semis, but they've got the home game against the Rebels, which should be a good one for him too. So it might be a kind of a if you can pair Sapawanga up with somebody. I don't know, for instance, I've got Sapawanga and who's the other one? Pollard in one particular league. Right. And when I was looking at that and trying to think about, how I could put together combinations, couldn't really find a better combination, of two fly halves than those two. I mean, taking sort of DMAC and, those sort of things out of the account and just looking at fixtures. Yeah. But yeah, so Sapawanga could be a player that could get you to the playoffs. The Stormers are actually on that list too, and so are the Brumbies, but they're both a little bit problematic in terms of, maybe not so much the Stormers, but just in terms of how it's gonna play out.
So I think just on that, again, the Stormers, I've got on my list, and we'll maybe cover a little more detail down later on. They miss the Fantasy Rugby Draft final. They also miss Game Week 16. So for me, you've got a couple of good matchups coming up. Not the Chiefs, but they do play the Moon Puppies at some stage after that. It might be time, certainly if you're in the playoffs or in the mix, is to start thinking about shipping some of these guys and getting paid for it, and maybe even dangling out the Sunwolves carrot around that time, because it gets pretty tough. And as I say, they miss the Fantasy Rugby Draft playoff final. So yeah, big implications there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of mentioned it last week. I managed to sort of stay pretty clear of the Stormers, and it wasn't, from the beginning, it wasn't necessarily about the fantasy playoffs and the final, obviously, but now, that's the number one thing I've got in my mind. So, people offering me Stormers players, I'm staying well away.
Yep.
So around halfbacks, it's actually, weirdly enough, it's the Jags and Sunwolves that have the best matchups for halfbacks, but I tend to kind of feel that the halfback matchup maybe isn't as relevant as some of the other positions. And I also think, well, we know that, what's his name? It's,
for Sunwolves, Tanaka or Bertrano?
Bertrano, that's who I was trying to think of. Yeah. He has not set the world on fire in any shape or form. I mean, they obviously rate him as better for the team than Lindaho, and you can't argue with the results, but he's not a fantasy scorer. And the Sunwolves, Tanaka,
maybe it's him, maybe it's not.
Exactly. And so I kind of think with halfback, it doesn't really matter too much. If you've got, Pulu or TJ or whoever else, you're sticking with them. So, it's kind of irrelevant a little bit. Loose forwards, players with good fixtures running up to the playoffs are the Canes, Rebels, Sunwolves and Bulls. Mm-hmm. So, obviously if you've got Murphy, no surprises, he's going to go pretty well. Canes, I mean, that's a little bit of a tricky one as well. I mean, Artie, if you've got Artie, you're sticking with Artie. Amongst the other guys, I don't know, they've been pretty hit and miss too. Like even in easy matchups like the one against the Sunwolves, it was difficult to pin your hat on any one of those guys. Shields is up and down and Evans is up and down and and they tend to have a bit of a rotating cast.
Exactly.
So not too much to probably take away from there. Locks, I probably feel pretty similar about locks than I do about halfbacks. And the other thing is it throws up here is that the team with the best matchups for locks is actually the Sunwolves. But once again, it'll be difficult to pick out an individual, especially because, the guy that they've got at lock isn't actually playing lock.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
So it does, so it throws up, some sort of complexities around, players playing out of position, which we can't, cater for. Yeah. We only have them as positions in the game. Reds once again in that category, and Bulls. So, if you've got Lidiaga, he's somebody that's actually worth sticking by.
Yep.
And then in the front row, and the front row is probably the one that actually means the most because it has the less variations. You know a front row is always going to play in the front row, at least at Super Rugby level anyway. So the Waratahs, Reds, Chiefs and Rebels have the best fixtures running up to the playoffs. And the Reds and Rebels actually have the strongest in the playoffs as well. So if you can get your hands on the Reds front row, I think that's something that you really, want to do if you can. And then on the flip side, the Sharks actually have the toughest fixtures in the playoffs. So, I've got a kind of a list of a few players here that I thought are worth looking at trading away. And because they're quite big names, I think you can get good things for them. Just
before you jump into that,
yeah,
I just want to pick up on your front row point because I think it's really interesting because we've just had a really significant front row injury with Malcolm Marx and the Lions. So I know I'm keeping abreast of a league elsewhere who's had a conversation around someone's going to the playoffs, they have the Reds front row. Would you be selling the Reds and getting the Lions front row? And the answer was no, I'd prefer the Reds, with the implication being that Marx is likely to come back maybe before internationals, but probably afterwards, and the Lions front row becomes interesting. But they also miss a match in semi-final game week 2 as
That's
well,
right.
So you're humming and hawing there. Something to be aware of anyway. If you've got the Lions front row, have a look to see who owns them and see if it's worth your while to try and pick them up on the premise that Marx is likely going to come back for the fantasy playoffs. Sorry, I interrupted you. You got some names for us that you want to throw away?
Yeah, that's right. So these are guys that I would look pretty seriously at trading away. And Buffelli and Moyano are two of them, and we talked about them earlier. Rico, and I think that's a good one because you can get just about anybody for Rico.
Yes.
And so you've got some really strong leverage there. And hey, I'm not saying definitely do it, because we're not saying he's not going to score. It's just that there could be players out there that are maybe just, ranked a little bit below him, but with the fixtures, could potentially be better. And, we're still a bit iffy around him and, playing 12 and these sorts of things and how it would be shifted around. So, just something to think about. Laumapi is another one.
Just a button on your Rico Ioane one. Well, you just finish off that point. So that's one half of the puzzle is bad fixtures, but he also might not be playing in those fixtures. So out of the Canes, Crusaders, Rebels and Bye, he's got to take 2 of those off. So you're not actually going to have him leading up to the playoffs anyway. And in the playoffs, not great fixtures. So I think exactly what you said. You have got an open slava to get absolutely anybody in the league because Rico Ioane is Rico Ioane. And it's probably only people that are listening to this podcast who are kind of a little bit next level that understand that, well, actually, what am I going to get for him? When am I actually going to use Rico if he's going to be rested in all these games? And then he's got tough matchups, and then he's playing at 12 or 13 as well. So there's some big factors there with Rico.
And players like Falau and Karevi, people they'll probably hesitate a little bit over that. But I think you could get Dalgunu, and that's something I think that, people
Easily.
need to seriously think about.
Easily.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay,
Laumapi.
and then Laumapi, yeah. So this is just in the playoffs. So he has tough fixtures for midfielders. Whether someone would get Karevi, whether you could get Karevi for him, I don't know. But like I said, it's just something to be aware of. Anton Leonard-Brown is another one. And these are all players that, you got. Anton Leonard-Brown, I think, is, at least he was, the top midfielder in terms of points. So, you're going to be able to get top value for these guys, which is exactly what you want. Sanchez, we talked about. Yankees is another one. And like you said, he's going to miss the second leg of the semi anyway. Yep. So, now's a good time to say, could you get Foley? Well, maybe this week, because of the Crusader thing. So if you could do that, Quagga Smith, I would look at trading away Quagga Smith if I could. And if I could get Caleb Timu, that would be a good swap. And then the Sharks front row, like I just said, not somebody that you actually want in the playoffs. If you get the Reds, even the Rebels, and the Rebels might be kicking around on the waiver wire. So it might be someone that, if you've got the spot, that you could actually just stash away and you could get them effectively for nothing.
Yeah, and I think they've got a few players coming back from injury as well. If you look at Jordan Ulysses, who's typically what props up a lot of the Rebels front row as well.
Yeah. So that's it really, as far as the sort of what's coming up, and throwing a few names out there. And I think we're at the stage of the season, and especially if you're listening to this podcast, you know that this is the stuff that you really, you need names. Yep. It's fine to sort of sit here and say, this guy's playing well, this guy's not playing well, but it's kind of like, okay, what do I do? What do I do about that?
Yep.
And I think we've actually thrown out a few scenarios where, if you're in that position, here are some concrete, steps that you could take.
Yep.
If you agree with us. If you don't, hey, sure, like I said, this is not an exact science, but at least, you're operating with some theory behind what you're trying to do.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm glad you actually brought some facts to the table, because what I've got is just eyeballing. I went through and looked at the next 6 weeks and looked at teams that you want to kind of start thinking about shifting away from if you're on the way to the playoffs. And Stormers was top of that list because of that final and because of Gameweek 16, potentially selling to guys a little bit lower down in the league table and say, look, these will get you over the lines and into the playoffs. You need to compensate me to get a player that's in the, that's going to play in that final game week. The next team is actually the Lions as well, and they miss semi-final 2 and game week 16. So all the South African teams plus the Jaguares miss game week 16. So that's something that you really need to be conscious of if you're scrapping away to try and get into those playoffs, is to look a couple of 3 weeks ahead and look at those. Other points in the Sunwolves, other points for the playoffs is that the Sunwolves play the Bulls, the Waratahs, and the Reds. So you've succinctly brought some stats to the table and actually emphasised the point of looking at those particular players in various positions in the playoffs. And then you look at the Blues; they finish away to the Canes and Satyrs, which is pretty ugly, but the Waratahs do have a good ones, right? So Rebels, Sunwolves, Brumbies in the playoffs. So yeah, that was just my kind of eyeball that I looked at. I think you need to be really conscious of looking where you are at the table. We're seeing a lot more trades that are coming through now because managers do understand where they sit on the table now. They are saying, right, I've held on to Milani Nano, I've held on to all of these guys now. I can't wait any longer. I need to make a push. I need to do something drastic. And you do, and you may need to cop it if you're not in a safe position in fantasy rugby draft playoff position. Then you need to, suck it up a little bit, swallow a little bit of pride, and maybe not get as much for a particular player. And players like Dalgunu are great examples where he's not a household name yet, and players like Rico Ioane and Laumapi are household names that you can get paid for and get paid for handsomely.
Yep. I mean, Dalgunu is one of those players. He's in this position now where he was kind of like a first season Karevi almost, where he's not an international player. There's not a lot of name recognition. He's scoring fantasy points, but sometimes that doesn't resonate with people still. I think this time next year or, draft time next year, we'll be having a completely different conversation about him, because he would have been vaulted up into those first few rounds, probably,
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting, and it's just going, and obviously we can break this down like kind of by individual performances against these teams, because you sort of look at it and some of them you think, wow, is that really true? And you kind of look at it, and when you're looking at the teams that have the most kind of points scored against them, per minute in certain positions, and as an example, so the Lions, the second best matchup for loose forwards, and you kind of look at it and you go, wow, why are the Lions, so bad in that kind of area, and obviously we don't have the analysis about why, but you can actually look at the individual performances and say, well, is there some sort of truth to that? And it does show up, you kind of look through and there's so many, double digit performances against them by kind of unfancied
Yep.
loose forwards.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I mean it's they're getting killed by guys like Murphy Taramai and and Roloff Smits and
Sure.
all of these kind of guys. So you can actually sort of look at it and you go, oh, okay, well these the Willie Britzes of the world, and
Yep.
they do put up points against this team, and I don't know why that is, but they do.
Dylan Hunt stand up this week.
Yeah,
Average player.
Yeah.
Big points against the Lions.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's something to keep an eye on, right? And, other kind of pretty unfancied players have done it, so, why not him?
Perfect. All right. Is that you? Is that your stats? Is that what you got?
Yeah, that's all we got for this week, so yeah.
Good man. Give us a wave, sign off.
Good luck.
Cheers, bud. So Mossman bought the heat, and he's had to shuffle off, so apologies. You're going to have to bear with me as I run through the various news and notes that we have. We don't usually like putting it out just with the one of us on there, but there was so much news that we have to cover that we felt we needed to at least inform our managers of what's going on. So we talked about the Chiefs. The only bit that I really wanted to touch on with the Jaguares was around the Tuchelet aspect. So I think we covered that off. Questions about De La Fuente or not. I think someone posed a question whether you'd have De La Fuente or Walter Little's son, Michael Little. And personally, I think that the tying, deciding decision goes to just how many game weeks are left. And Walter Little's son, Michael Little, has got really good average points per game, but he just plays an extra game week as well. So I'd probably lean that way, even though that I think De La Fuente is a much better player than Walter Little's son, Michael Little. I think I'd still go. I'd probably go Michael Little. Let's get into the Crusaders. So a lot of what a few of these players form is linked with Richie Mo'unga. So we mentioned it, or repeating from the Start Bench show effectively, is that Seta's form is linked to Richie Mo'unga. Let's see that in a longer stretch or a longer sample size, but certainly was the case last season. Havili got a knock, a little bit of concussion. I say a little bit of concussion. You're either concussed or you're not. For me, he's an outside back three at the moment, maximum. I'm very, very nervous about him as well. He's got one more All Black rest week in him, and that could well be this week if he's got a head knock at the same time and they're playing the Waratahs at home. I personally, if I have Havili, I am looking, and Mossman just brought it up before around the playoff schedule and leading up to it as well. Crusaders have a little bit of a toughish run, and so I would look at players like Dianti. He mentioned Dalgunu. I'd even think about SP Murray now, even though we did mention about the resting, and not the resting, pardon me. We talked about the bye week and we talked about the final as well not being there. So, and as much as I am down on Ruan Combrink, it's probably at the point now where I'd prefer even to roll the dice on Combrink, stash him on my bench until he gets back to South Africa and see if there's some sort of uptick in form for Havili. Samu was good. He gets in a lot, and he gets in a lot of those tram angles. It didn't look like Seta was ever actually going to pass him the ball in the end to score that try. And he was saved a little bit by that try, but that is his MO. He scores those tries, and he makes those long breaks. Chance Jordan Tafua might be rested at some point as well, because he's taken a hell of a battering over the last few weeks with Samu out injured and a few other players out injured, so he's picked up the slack. So Samu could go to 8. Crusaders front row was the top scorer in our start bench manager pro giveaway, 41 points, and we didn't get anyone picking that up. It was a lot of popular DMAC suggestions, but again, we'll be doing that on 6:30 on Friday night on Facebook. We're doing our start bench show, and we want you to see if you can figure out who's going to be the top point scorer of the week. It's proving very difficult. The Rebels, I think the interesting point about the Rebels is Rich Freeman broke it during the week that it's not so much about the Rebels, it's more around the Sunwolves getting all of their Brave Blossom players pulled out of the squad for the Gameweek 15-16 against the Rebels and the Brumbies. So that'll be a weakened squad for the Sunwolves, so players that you have to look out for there. There's a question mark whether Mafi might be part of that players that are pulled out into that Japanese squad, but the Rebels have no obligation to release them outside of the international window, and I would be very, very surprised if they did do that and allowed that to happen in such a pivotal time for the Rebels as well. So, I think certainly something to be keeping an eye on. I believe the squad for the Brave Blossoms is being announced sometime later this week or early next week, but just keep a watching brief on that. Probably need to look around. So the Brumbies match this week, and then after that they've got a decent run of fixtures as well. Mossman alluded to it. Hurricanes, sounds like TJ Perinara might be back this week, going from what a couple of the beat writers, Hamish Bidwell, was mentioning on Twitter. Sounds like he's a little bit more likely to play. Geordie Barrett was a bit of a disaster, got pulled about half an hour before kickoff. Doesn't sound too good. They've got this rule that they have in place where if you're not playing training on Monday, then you're not considered, which I think is a little bit mischievous. I think that might be the Julian Savea rule. I suspect Geordie wasn't training, but they will suggest that he was doing light running, which leaves him in contention for the week and obfuscates that rule that they've made for themselves. Milner scattered back. I think he's likely go back to 15 again if Geordie's not there. He'll be better for his run out. I wouldn't just plug and play Julian Savea and think that he's going to be there this week. Boyd, when he mentioned dropping Arso out of the 23 last week, he mentioned that they would still have a rotation policy in place at the moment. So team news should come out in a few hours around that. K's front row, mentioned it again with Mossman. Just another guy at the moment without Coles, who looks like he's just going to go and hang his boots up and play a fireman. No, I laugh. I jest. He's going to aim for the World Cup, but it doesn't look like he's going to play Super Rugby. And Amu is out for a while as well. So yeah, they come right back to the pack, and is a front row that I just would not want to be owning. Let's jump into the Lions. So we've been down on Combrick for a while now, for the last couple of weeks. I know Mossman's kind of holding out a little bit more hope than I have, in so much that he wanted to see unless you can tell me what is discernibly different to what he was doing last year, what have we got to go on? My personal view, he just doesn't look the same player. He's whiffing on tackles, and it's not just the fact that it's Ben Lamb running against him either. He's another one that I'd just put in the OB3 bracket, and potentially you'd have some bye week guys, some guys that might come in, injury replacements that means he drops to the bench. If I could drop him to the bench, I probably would. Skoman, Marnus Skoman, he's in absolutely everything. He is full on, and that may continue. He looks like he wants to get his hands on the ball close to the try line as well, which is always pretty handy. So maybe the Shannon Frizzell light is kind of going out and the Marnus Skoman light is going back on. So yeah, I think I'll be surprised if he's available in your league, but if he is, grab him. Hard to see what's happening in midfield. It looks like Swiss's preference is for a Vorster Mapo midfield. Mapo is pretty junk for FRD, but that's got, it's tough for Van Rensburg owners who've drafted him pretty early, I expect, as well. I being one of those. Very, very frustrating. I do wonder whether he's had his head turned by the big money up north, in Gloucester and Sale, fighting for his services next season, and I just wonder if that's taken a lot of his headspace. The classic football kind of parlance, he's had his head turned. Mosa owners, hope you're buying a lotto ticket last week, because we love a last play of the game try, just like the Matalei owner, to be honest. He scored on the final play of the game against the Rebels. Very good. Blues, so the great indie band, the Resting Ioanes, touched on it. Canes, Crusaders, Rebels bye the next 4 game weeks leading into the playoffs, so they need to have 2 in that. It'd be really interesting to see this Canes lineup, because they are at home. I wonder if they split the 2 and say, look, what do the Canes do well? It's outside backs, so we'll rest Akira. What do the Crusaders do better? They're much more of a forward-orientated, mauling type team. Put the pressure on you that way. And so resting Rico in that instance. But big implications there. They have to rest one of them for the Hurricanes and Crusaders, and then they'll almost certainly rest it for the Rebels. And it may just be linked with when Collins and Nanai are back, and we know Collins has been given a little bit more detail. It shouldn't be too far away from coming back, but we just haven't heard anything. It's been deathly quiet for Nanai. Managers from a while back will remember the Vicenia drama that we had to put him on a few milk cartons to figure out where he'd gone. It looks like it's happening all over again with Nanai, with just real scant information about where he actually is. Sonny Bill Williams coming back this week will probably make a little bit of a difference, and may also have implications for when they can rest Rico. And it may be all right that for Tana to think about resting those guys now. They do quite like Urban Ledger in 13, so it would be good to have Sonny Bill Williams in 12, because that means players like Tamua Manu and Ronnie Clark's son, Caleb Clark, on the wing actually get the ball, which would be nice to see. Caleb Clark and Manu actually look pretty decent. They're OB3, OB4s, and certainly if they don't have Rico Ioane inside them, I think they bounce up into that OB3 conversation. That's probably a good segue, actually, when we talk about Caleb Clark, is to discuss the under-20s. We have, for Caleb in particular, he missed out on the Oceania New Zealand under-20s tournament, and the tagline was, or at least the throwaway mention in the article was that Caleb had Super Rugby commitments, so he wasn't missing that for the Oceania tournament. And I guess the implication is that he is still in the frame for the under-20s, which starts at the end of the month. So, and that is when the Blues have the buys later on in the month as well. I think the Rebels is the one they play in the last game week before the break, but certainly the bye week is in there as well. So it may be that Clark goes somewhere around that game week 15-16 mark and joins the camp for the under-21s. I believe it's up north. From other under-20s players, Valentini is one, and Willemse is the other consideration. Valentini, so I'm not sure when they've asked to play and when they've asked to be pulled into the squads. They start that match, the tournament, say about the 30th of May. I think the first game in the under-20s is, and they've got to fly up there, so I would expect certainly to miss the week before that. Certainly to miss the game that week, and whether they miss the week before that is the one in question. But they'll be back for the playoffs as well that you can stash, obviously injury aside. And Damien Willemse is a really interesting one. It's really, really difficult because for a number of reasons to understand what's going on. The first reason being the associations and the unions and the countries aren't particularly good anyway at keeping us abridged of what is going on in terms of who they're selecting and when they're going to be away on tour or with the team. And then secondly, there seems to be chopping and changing. So in Willemsen's instance, they originally said that he was going to play the third match of the warm-up, which is, I think it might be I can't remember if it's the Scotland or the Ireland one, whatever the one is this Friday. And he wasn't going to play the first two. That was the plan. This morning we've woken up in New Zealand and there's been a subtle change to that plan where Willemse is going to play this week against the Chiefs. And then the implication was that he's likely to join up with the under-20s there because they have the Sunwolves and then they have a break as well. So for me, it's a little bit frustrating that you couldn't really have this ironed out a little bit earlier. The Stormers really just needed to look at the fixture list and say, well, who should when can we release them, and see the Sunwolves and go, right, okay, well, it's a fairly clear line in the sand that we can offer up the services from, and certainly now with Jean-Luc Duplessis back makes a big difference. Mossman covered the Waratahs, which is good. I wanted to I've got a note here that I wanted to look at onboarding some of these Waratahs playoffs. Good grief, Waratahs players. You might be able to get Rona very, very cheaply as well, but I think he's too good a player to be on the bench. I think they will eventually figure out that he is someone that either is going to shuffle onto the wing or at centre. Certainly he put up some good performances when he was playing there. So you might be able to get something, you might be able to get him cheaply. And players like Gordon, Hooper and Mossman mentioned the front row as well. So you're going to have to do it over the next kind of 3 weeks, which is, they're tough ones with the Crusaders, Chiefs and Highlanders, or toughish or tougher. So you might just want to stage them in, but once it gets to the playoffs, you'll be pretty happy you've got those TARS players in it. Stormers, SP Murray is strong again. Implications, not necessarily for him, it's more for Lades, Rule, Sinatla. I guess JJ and Goodbeck is probably part of that conversation as well, but a big question mark about how they all fit into two positions. Starting to wonder if maybe Lates is the one that's going to be the odd one out there. They do like him in that team, whether it's just for balance or a little bit of experience, but back to his normal self on the wing, and he is someone that is a genuine fringe OB3, OB4 type player. They play the Sunwolves, and as I mentioned, in Gameweek 14, so you might be able to sell, to managers that are trying to make that playoffs, because then you're not exposed too much for the Gameweek 16 and also the Fantasy Rugby Draft final. Sharks, no real surprise, I guess, with the front row there. They go pretty well as far as the Warthog goes. When he starts, it usually means good things for the Sharks front row. Came out of the blocks pretty quickly here, and they just full court press for the Highlanders. Didn't really let up. Mikosi got his hands on the ball a lot more. Dan Dupree also was a lot more prominent. I was going to ask Mossman a question around his brother, Robert Dupree, as well, and whether where he saw him in fly halves, because I think I originally had him down here as a top 2 fly half, but I think I was being a bit aggressive. I think if you look at Bowden Barrett, Bernard Foley and Richie Monger, they're probably still 2, 3 and 4, and maybe Dupree's in there at number 5. But suffice to say, he's exceptional and he's putting up a lot of points. Highlanders, Rob Thompson put a little bit of a knock, so I'd want to get a little bit of insurance this week, just to make sure that he is, if he doesn't turn out in the starting lineup, that you do have cover. The Barracuda is on the horizon. Not sure exactly. Major wasn't committing to a time frame when asked about it, but he's not far away. It looks like might have a bit of a recovery for Jet Li as well. It didn't sound very good at the time when he flew home, but the scans, from all accounts that we've heard, the scans have come back fairly positive, and he's running with the team again. So hopefully we see him this week, and Lee managers that have held on to him then continue to do so until we get the team named. And if he isn't named, then you'll probably get a fairly good indication from Mage about how long he'll be out for. There's still some resting implications for Naholo and the Smiths. So if I had to guess, we'd suggest maybe it was the Tars game, which is next week. Because you've got that All Black camp, they missed the first half of the week anyway, so you do wonder. Yeah, you do wonder whether it is just an element of. They look at, well, we don't want them to be missing that the first half of the week anyway. It disrupts our preparation, and I think we've got precedent there as well with Major, what he did with Kane Hamilton when he came up to the Blues as well. There was an All Black camp then at that point, and he said, "Oh, Kane's been with us all week, so we wanted to go that direction." So we wonder if the Waratahs is the game that they're going to target. But of course, the other one that they could think of is this weekend as well with the Lions. So factors to think about. The Sunwolves. We talked about the Japanese team asking for those players in game week 15-16. Just for those asking, Salmaki isn't eligible. He doesn't play for Japan, linked with the Tongan Sevens. I believe there was a case a while ago around this. Either way, he'll be available and probably be decent for the next few weeks as well, and certainly against the Rebels Brumbies. It's just how much of a team they can actually stitch together. They should be okay. Maybe even better. Who knows? Labuskakni, he's gone. Bit of a blindside there. He was playing well as well. He's been, well, apparently it's BAU because it was part of a contract that's only just come to light. Brumbies, Chance Penny opens up for Jimmy D. Who probably will go all right this week. Mossman mentioned it's good to play against the Rebels. I think it is too. And for those that aren't playing Fantasy Rugby Draft, this is an illustration of the everyday challenge facing Fantasy Rugby Draft managers. Jimmy D becomes a thing. There is just nothing on the waiver wire, and you are scratching around for every little morsel. And he's the type of player that can do a job for a week. But it's pretty dire out there, but it just really illustrates the difficulty of Fantasy Rugby Draft and the challenge that faces a lot of our managers. Reds, activate Operation Sunwolves. No real need for conversation. Mossman also looked at their long-term potential as well in the playoffs and leading up to it. So a lot of managers have already done that, looking at the waiver wire stats this morning. There's a lot of Reds that have come on board. It'll be interesting to see. We talked about Dargunu a lot. We need to figure out who that other wing is because Parisi didn't have a start last week, and there's a little bit of a surprise. A few raised eyebrows as Jordan Parisi and Jaden Namanu, I believe, are in the mix as well. I would have expected Parisi to longer term get that job, but yeah, as I say, there is an opportunity to back against Parisi and pick up those unfancied Reds players just on the chance that they may actually get named against the Sunwolves. That's probably from the teams that we looked at. I mentioned around all of the buys that we looked at. We wanted to go through and figure out who is playing at least in the playoffs, and I think the most important to understand is the buys. Game week 16, if you're trying to make the playoffs, you're without all of your African players and the Hawaras as well. And then in the playoffs, game week 17, the Brumbies aren't playing. Game week 18, the Lions aren't playing. And game week 19, which is your Fantasy Rugby Draft final, the Stormers aren't playing. So just something to be aware of. I was going to go through 4 in Form, which is brought to you by Manager Pro. Go to www.fantasyrugbydraft.com/Manager Pro. However, Mossman isn't here, so I was going to say we might have actually rattled through a little bit quicker because, Lord knows it hasn't been a strong point as figuring out form, and that just kind of highlights how valuable form is. That it may not be the fancy players that you think of that bring the cream to the crop, but players like Geordie Barrett actually was the top of that list, and that was based on one performance 2 weeks ago. But good ones in there like Matalei and Folau this week at the same time. But a point to note on for Manager Pro, Premiership product, the Premiership Season Pass is just about to come up for expiry, so we're going to put a little deal out there. You can buy your Premier Rugby Pass for next season, and it'll include the next couple of weeks the end of Super Rugby, shall we say. You can do it that way, or we've also just dropped the price of Manager Pro normally anyway till the end of the season. So go check that out. Put the tagline in there before. That's probably as much as we can get through. There's a lot of questions. I had a few more bits and pieces to cover off with Mossman, a few more trade questions that we'll shelve for next week. Thanks for downloading and listening. You can follow us on Twitter at Fantasy Rugby Draft, or drop us a note at support@fantasyrugbydraft.com. My name is Bruce Wilkinson, and to your Repeato.
What a bust here by Christian Cullen. Plenty of support, and what a dummy!